produced the first of these paintings, in which he showed Lord Clive being welcomed by Mir Jafar after the Battle of Plassey. In his painting, Heyman glorified British victory, but left out the fact that the British had won the Battle of Plassey through treachery and conspiracy. Tipu Sultan, a powerful enemy of the British, was defeated in 1799 in the famous Battle of Seringapatam. David Wilkie painted a picture in which he depicted the discovery of the body of Tipu Sultan by General Sir David Baird. He showed General Baird standing triumphantly over Tipu's body. The painting seems to announce, "This is the fate of those who dare to oppose the British."
ठीक है, तो ये क्या दिखा रही थी कि ये टीपू सुल्तान की बॉडी इनको मिली है ब्रिटिशर्स को, और एक तरीके से क्या मैसेज दे रही थी कि ये हाल उन सब लोगों का होगा जो भी ब्रिटिशर्स को अपोज करेंगे, ब्रिटिशर्स का विरोध करेंगे.
Here's an opportunity.
इंडियन आर्टिस्ट पे क्या इम्पैक्ट था?
From the 18th century onwards, many European artists came to India, bringing with them new conventions in painting, such as oil painting, as well as new styles, such as realism. But in the wake of all these Western influences on the Indian art scene, what happened to Indian artists?
ठीक है, अब ये
How
जो
did the
नए नए
Indian
चेंजेस,
painters at royal courts react to these changes?
यूरोपियन आए, अपने साथ नई आर्ट फॉर्म लेके आए, ऑयल पेंटिंग की टेक्निक लेके आए और वेरियस टेक्निक्स लेके आए जो रियल होती थी. तो इन सब का भारतीय जो कलाकार थे, इंडियन जो पेंटर्स थे, आर्टिस्ट थे, उनके ऊपर क्या असर हुआ, उसको स्टडी करते हैं कि जो इंडियन पेंटर्स थे रॉयल कोर्ट में, उन्होंने किस तरीके से रिएक्ट किया.
In Mysore, Tipu Sultan ordered local artists to cover the walls of his Darya Daulat palace at Seringapatam with mural paintings. In the court of Bengal, the British had defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla and installed their puppet Nawabs on the throne, first Mir Zafar and then Mir Qasim. These Nawabs encouraged local artists to absorb British tastes and styles in art. Gradually, with the establishment of British power, Indian court artists lost their wealth and influence. At the same time, British officials wanted paintings through which they could understand and depict India to the Western world. And so they commissioned court artists to produce a vast number of paintings of local plants and animals, historical buildings and monuments, festivals, trades and crafts, castes and communities. These pictures, collected by the East India Company officials, came to be known as company paintings. But what about painters outside the royal courts? What kind of art did they produce?
अब ये बात तो गई उनकी जो कि रॉयल कोर्ट में काम करते थे, लेकिन जो ऐसे पेंटर्स थे, ऐसे आर्टिस्ट थे जो रॉयल कोर्ट्स के बाहर काम करते थे, ठीक है, व्हाट काइंड ऑफ आर्ट डिड दे प्रोड्यूस, वो किस तरीके की आर्ट प्रोड्यूस करते थे जो रॉयल कोर्ट्स में काम नहीं करते थे, कोर्ट के बाहर काम करते थे, यानी कि जो कोर्ट में काम करते थे उनके अलावा जो रह गए आर्टिस्ट, वो किस तरीके की पेंटिंग्स प्रोड्यूस करते थे, उनको देख लेते हैं.
Before the 19th century in Bengal, the village scroll painters called Patuas and the potters called Kumors, who lived around the temple of Kalighat, had produced images of gods and goddesses. Traditionally, the figures in these scroll paintings looked two-dimensional. After a while, Kalighat painters began to use shading to make the images look three-dimensional.
ठीक है, थ्री डायमेंशनल हमने समझा था क्लास में भी। क्या होती है थ्री डायमेंशनल? कि उसकी तीन एंगल, किसी भी पिक्चर के तीन एंगल आपको दिखाई दे, यानी कि सिंगल डायमेंशन ना होके पहले क्या था, फ्लैट पेंटिंग करते थे इंडियन आर्टिस्ट, ठीक है। उसके बाद जैसे जैसे उन्होंने यूरोपियन स्टाइल को अडॉप्ट करा, उनसे सीखा, तो वो थ्री डायमेंशनल जो है पेंटिंग करने लगे।
19th century, Calcutta was expanding as a commercial and administrative center. So many village artists moved from the surrounding villages into Calcutta in the hope of finding new patrons and new buyers for their art. After the 1840s, the Kalighat painters mocked people who adopted Western styles and customs. Initially,
कालीघाट के पेंटर्स जैसे कुछ लोग ऐसे, कुछ पेंटर्स ऐसे भी थे जो कि वेस्टर्न स्टाइल को फॉलो नहीं करते थे, उनको पसंद नहीं करते थे।
The Kalighat painters made images engraved on wooden blocks.
ठीक है, कालीघाट पेंटर्स क्या करते थे, इस तरीके से वुडन ब्लॉक से जो है कोई भी इमेज को बनवाते थे, स्कल्पचर करते थे।
These were then inked, pressed against paper, and finally colored by hand.
ठीक है, उस वुडन ब्लॉक पे उसका इम्प्रेशन, उसका जो है उकेरते थे उसको, पिक्चर को जो भी उनको बनानी होती थी उसका स्कल्पचर तैयार करते थे, उसके बाद उस पर कलर करते थे और उसका इम्प्रेशन पेपर पे ले लेते थे। ठीक है, पेपर पे जब उसका इम्प्रेशन आ जाता था तो दैट मीन्स उसकी आउटलाइंस आ जाती थी वहाँ पे, और उसके अंदर की कलर फिलिंग जो है बाय हैंड ये आर्टिस्ट किया करते थे। ठीक है, तो इस तरीके की टेक्निक ये यूज करते थे।
By the late 19th century, mechanical printing presses were set up in different parts of India, which allowed prints to be mass-produced and sold cheap in the markets. Even the poor could buy them now.
ठीक है, प्रिंटिंग प्रेस आने के बाद क्या हो गया, बहुत लार्ज क्वांटिटी में पिक्चर्स प्रोड्यूस होने लगी और फिर ये इतनी सस्ती हो गई कि गरीब लोग भी इनको खरीद सकते थे।
Middle-class Indian artists who were trained in British art schools and learned new methods of life study, oil painting and printmaking. They set up printing presses such as the Calcutta Art Studio and produced prints for a wide market. These studios produced lifelike images of eminent Bengali personalities, as well as realistic mythological figures located in picturesque landscape settings. And then, in the early 20th century, a rising wave of nationalism engulfed the nation. Art was not immune to this nationalist fervor.
ठीक है, इसके बाद जब नेशनल मूवमेंट भारत में स्टार्ट हुआ तो आर्ट यानी कि पेंटिंग जो थी वो भी उससे अछूती नहीं रही, आर्ट फॉर्म में भी हमें जो है नेशनलिज्म की फीलिंग्स दिखाई देने लगी। ठीक है,
What kind of influence did nationalism have on art?
अब जो नेशनलिज्म का जो भावना उस समय पे लोगों के मन में आ रही थी, बहुत ज़्यादा जो है इसका इन्फ्लुएंस था, उसका इन्फ्लुएंस किस तरीके से हुआ आर्ट पे, उसको हम स्टडी करते हैं। आर्ट को किस तरीके से प्रभावित किया इसने, आर्ट एंड नेशनलिज्म।
With the rising wave of nationalism, popular prints of the early 20th century began carrying nationalist messages. Raja Ravi Verma was the first artist who tried to create a style that was both modern and national.
Raja Ravi
Verma mastered the Western art of oil painting and realistic life study, but painted themes from Indian mythology.
ठीक है, राजा रवि वर्मा पहले ऐसे भारतीय आर्टिस्ट थे जिन्होंने मॉडर्न और ट्रेडिशनल दोनों मेथड का एक जो है ब्लेंड यूज किया, और ये क्या कहते थे कि मुझे जो है मैं मास्टर हूँ वेस्टर्न आर्ट, जैसे कि ऑयल पेंटिंग है, रियलिस्टिक लाइफ स्टडी है, लेकिन मैं क्या प्रेफर करता हूँ, टू पेंट थीम्स फ्रॉम इंडियन माइथोलॉजी, भारतीय देवी देवताओं की या इंडियन पौराणिक जो कथाएं हैं उनकी पेंटिंग करना चाहता हूँ।
From the 1880s, Ravi Verma's mythological paintings became very popular among Indian princes and art collectors. Responding to the huge popular appeal of his paintings, Ravi Verma decided to set up a picture production team and printing press on the outskirts of Bombay.
ठीक है, तो इनकी जो पेंटिंग्स थी वो राजकुमारों में, महलों में बहुत ज़्यादा फेमस हो जाती है। तो इनके पेंटिंग्स की जब डिमांड बढ़ने लगती है तो ये क्या करते हैं, अपनी एक प्रिंटिंग प्रेस की स्थापना करते हैं, प्रिंटिंग प्रेस बनाते हैं और वहाँ पे से फिर लार्ज क्वांटिटी में जो इनकी पेंटिंग्स होती थी उसकी कॉपीज ये मार्केट में बेचने लगते हैं।
Here, colored prints of his religious paintings were mass produced. Even the poor could now buy these cheap prints. In Bengal, a new group of nationalist artists gathered around Abanindranath Tagore, the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore. They rejected Ravi Verma's art as westernized and broke away from the convention of oil painting and realistic style. Instead, they drew inspiration from the medieval Indian tradition of miniature painting and the ancient art of mural painting as seen in the Ajanta cave. They were also influenced by the art of Japanese artists who visited India at that time.
ठीक है, तो अविंद्रनाथ टैगोर और इनके जैसे जो आर्टिस्ट थे वो जो है पसंद नहीं करते थे रवि वर्मा की पेंटिंग्स को, और ये कहते थे कि हमें वेस्टर्न मेथड्स को नहीं यूज़ करना चाहिए, नहीं अपनाना चाहिए, बल्कि जो हमारा जो इंडियन ट्रेडिशनल है मिनिएचर पेंटिंग का, एंशिएंट आर्ट है हमारी मूरल पेंटिंग्स की, जो कि अजंता के उसमें देखने को मिलती है। इसके अलावा जैपनीज़ पेंटिंग से भी ये बहुत इंस्पायर थे, क्योंकि जो जैपनीज़ आर्टिस्ट इंडिया में आए थे तो उनकी टेक्निक देख के इनको वो भी बहुत पसंद थी। तो कुल मिला के ये भारतीय ट्रेडिशनल जो आर्ट फॉर्म्स थी उसको ही जो है प्रेफरेंस देते थे।
The effort to define what ought to be an authentic Indian style of art continued. After the 1920s, a new generation of artists began to break away from Abanindranath Tagore's artistic style. Some saw it as sentimental. Others thought that spiritualism could not be seen as the central feature of Indian culture. They felt that instead of illustrating ancient books, artists should seek inspiration from living folk art and tribal designs. As the debates continued, new movements in art grew and styles of art changed.
ठीक है, ये क्या प्रेफर करते थे कि अपने आसपास जो चीजें हो रही है उनकी पेंटिंग बनाई जाए।
Here's a chance to recall the main points covered in the The British ruled India for almost 2 centuries. And during this 200-year rule, the British introduced various architectural changes that transformed the landscape of India. They developed roads and railways and introduced better means of communication to enhance their economic, military, and administrative operations. What's more, imperial power was also stressed through the construction of grand government buildings in premier British locations such as Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, and Delhi. Can you recall any examples of buildings built by the British which are still standing even today?
ऐसे कौन सी जो बिल्डिंग्स है जो कि ब्रिटिशर्स ने बनवाई थी जो कि आज भी जो है स्टैंडिंग है?
Calcutta was the erstwhile capital of the British Empire in India. Hence, many imposing government buildings were constructed there. Chief among them was the Raj Bhavan, which was modelled on Kedleston Hall, a great house in Derbyshire, in the United Kingdom. The Writers' Building, which was the civil service headquarters, as well as the High Court, was built in the Gothic style. The General Post Office and the Town Hall were built in the neoclassical style. The Victoria Memorial, built between 1906 and 1921, is a huge structure in the Renaissance style, faced with white marble. In Bombay, perhaps the most famous landmark is the Gateway of India. Why do you think it was built? It commemorates King George V's visit to India in 1911. Public buildings such as the Mint and the Town Hall were built in the Western neoclassical style. But Bombay is most famous for buildings such as the High Court, the Bombay University, the Municipal Corporation Office, the Central Telegraph Office, the General Post Office, and Victoria Terminus, all of which were built in the Gothic style. These buildings were constructed during the city's boom period. Many of them were decorated with carvings made by Indian craft workers. When the British shifted their capital from Calcutta to Delhi, the architects Edward Lutyens and Herbert Baker were called in to construct the new capital. The government complex consisted of a 2-mile avenue, Kingsway, now called Rajpath, that led to the Viceroy's Palace, now known as Rashtrapati Bhavan, with the Secretariat buildings on either side of the avenue. In Madras, Fort St. George was built in 1653 by the British East India Company. St. Mary's Church, the oldest Anglican church in Asia, was constructed in 1680. British architecture in India was modelled on 2 important architectural styles. What were these styles? The 2 architectural styles that were predominantly used in British buildings were the Gothic style and the neoclassical styles of Greece and Rome. Take a look at the Victoria Terminus. The pointed arches and elongated structures are typical of the Gothic style. Indeed, most of the buildings built by the British in the mid-19th century in Bombay were in this style. Now take a look at the General Post Office in Calcutta, built in the 1860s. The rounded arches and pillars are typical of the neoclassical style of Greece and Rome. The British deliberately built grand, imposing structures to express their power and glory. They made sure that the new buildings asserted British importance. A case in point is the Vansroy's Palace, built in Delhi. The architect Lutyens made sure that the building was higher than Shah Jahan's Jama Masjid.
ठीक है, इन्होंने वॉइसरायज पैलेस को इतना हाई बनाया था कि वो शाहजहां का पैलेस जो हो उससे ऊंचा रहे. ठीक है.
By the mid-19th century, photographers from Europe were traveling to India, taking pictures, setting up studios, and establishing photographic societies to promote the art of photography. Some of them were portrait painters who began taking photographs of imperial officers, presenting them as figures of authority and power. Others, such as Samuel Vaughan, traveled around the country searching for ruined buildings and picturesque landscapes, which they captured through the lenses of their cameras. Often, these photographs conveyed the notion that India was an ancient and decaying civilization, which British administration would revive.
ठीक है, इस तरीके की पेंटिंग्स दिखाई जाती थी भारत की कि भारत जो है काफी पिछड़ा हुआ है और यहाँ पे सिविलाइजेशन नहीं है और जो ब्रिटिश एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन है वो ही इसे दोबारा से जिंदा कर सकता है.
Did you know that Samuel Vaughan came to India in the early 1860s and